Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something genuinely fascinating from our source material. We're going to explore a blueprint from educator Jin Lee that outlines exactly how to build a highly structured learning environment, specifically an open model known as the Open PMC, or Personal Mentoring Cell Protocol. But here's what makes this uniquely compelling. We're going to look at a Tier 1 implementation of this protocol, which means mapping its secular, worldview-neutral framework directly into the rich, classical vocabulary of Islamic pedagogy. It is an absolutely incredible look at how modern educational structures can seamlessly integrate with ancient spiritual and psychological traditions, ultimately helping students truly own their learning and their worldview. Okay, let's look at our roadmap for today. We've got 5 key areas to cover. First, the problem of drift. Second, taqwā as the conscious antidote. Third, the 6 M's framework. Fourth, measuring whole life success. And fifth, starting your own cell. Section 1. The problem of drift, understanding the default human condition. Right now, think about what teenagers everywhere are up against. They are facing this relentless shaping force from digital algorithms that are constantly molding their desires, their identities, and their emotional landscapes. And this modern technological struggle brings us to a really compelling question. Can a framework of rigorous personal choice actually coexist with a tradition built on submission? This is honestly the sharpest version of a very common concern we see among parents. If you introduce a framework based on rigorous, examined personal choice, does that challenge a religious tradition built on divine revelation? Well, our source article argues that this kind of examination isn't a threat to faith at all. Actually, it's the exact condition that transforms inherited tradition into genuine, resilient belief. To really grasp this, we've got to look at the Islamic diagnosis of the default human condition. And spoiler alert, the Quran doesn't describe our baseline state as comfortable or naturally virtuous. Instead, it uses the term ghafla. That means heedlessness. It's a state of forgetfulness or an unconscious drift away from our deepest responsibilities. Living in ghafla essentially means living on autopilot, just being swept along by habit, by social pressure, and, well, today, by algorithmic feeds. Moving into Section 2, taqwā, the conscious antidote, the structural expression of intention. So, if unconscious drift is the core problem, what's the fix? The tradition actually has a deeply operational antidote for this, explicitly naming it taqwā. It's a state of highly conscious, intentional awareness. It means every single act is oriented by deliberate choice rather than just caving to social pressure. And this state is driven by niyyah, or intention. In Islamic practice, no act of worship is even considered valid without this conscious intention. So, a mentoring cell built on this principle, it isn't just a casual study group, it literally becomes an institutionalized practice of taqwā in learning. And here is where it gets really cool. Look at how cleanly these concepts translate. On one hand, we have the worldview-neutral terms of the Open PMC Protocol, things like the Intentionality Phase, where a student makes a conscious choice before diving into a project. We can map that directly to the Islamic equivalent, niyyah, or intention. The secular protocol maps one-to-one with the Islamic concept of entering a learning cycle deliberately. You're taking a structural requirement of modern mentorship and filling it completely with an authentic, classical religious vocabulary. Section 3. The 6 M's Framework, a classical psychology of drift and awakening. We are transitioning now into the absolute core methodology of this system. We're looking at al-Muhasaba as-sitta, commonly known as the 6 M's. This is an 11th century framework developed by the brilliant Imam al-Ghazali. And today, it's actively taught in contemporary clinical settings by experts like Dr. Abdullah Rothman. What's amazing here is that this isn't just dusty old philosophy. It reads almost like a modern software protocol for psychological transformation. It breaks down an examined life into a recursive cycle with distinct temporal phases. So what happens before an act, during an act, after an act, and then the response? Let's actually walk through how this builds, chronologically step by step. First up, we have Musharata. That's setting the intention and agreeing on the conditions before acting. Second is Muraqaba, maintaining active vigilance during the act, being entirely present in the moment. Third is Muhasaba, which is the self-examination after the act, basically balancing the ledger of your own soul. Now, if you slip up, you move to the fourth, Muraqaba, which is a measured, self-corrective consequence. Fifth is Mujahada, a renewed striving and struggle to emulate righteous examples. And finally, Mu'aytaba, the active self-censure where you actually change your behavior in real time to close the loop. These stages map absolutely perfectly onto the planning, executing, and reflecting phases of any modern learning cycle. So what actually happens when a student repeatedly runs through these 6 M's? Well, they train their mind to discern the actual source of their inner thoughts or promptings. A thought might arise from the nafs, the lower self. It could come from shaitan, the adversary, from a malak, an angel, or directly as haqq, truth from God. Going through the PMC framework isn't just about finishing academic projects, right? It's generating the real experiential data a teenager needs to identify exactly where their inner voices are coming from. And that is a massive, incredibly valuable psychological skill. All right, Section 4, Measuring Whole Life Success, the Maqāṣid al-Sharī. You might be wondering, how do we actually define success here if we aren't just looking at a grade point average? Well, the protocol requires something called a whole life success profile. For an Islamic cell, a founder can build this profile directly using the Maqāṣid al-Sharī, the classical objectives of Islamic law. Just look at this list. You are measuring a student's growth in deen, their spiritual integrity, nafs, their physical well-being, aql, their critical intellect, nasl, community continuity and connection, mal, their economic competence, and karama, basic human dignity. It is a completely holistic, fully fleshed out flourishing framework drawn straight from classical jurisprudence. Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, Starting Your Own Cell, 4 actionable steps for implementation. Now that we've mapped out the architecture, let's talk about the practical side of actually launching one of these cells. The process breaks down into 4 clear, actionable steps. Step 1 is simply reading the worldview-neutral protocol specification, so you truly understand the structural pillars. Step 2 is absolutely crucial. You have to identify a mentor who possesses Islamic knowledge, but more importantly, someone who actually practices this kind of self-examination in their own life. You can't guide a student through vigilance if you don't practice it yourself, right? Step 3, establish your cell's whole life success profile, just like we discussed. And Step 4, run your very first intentionality phase session, naming the conditions and intentions before the learning cycle begins. And of course, just a quick reminder here, any implementation must naturally comply with your local safeguarding laws and parental consent requirements. All of this really anchors into one profound psychological truth. As Dr. Abdullah Rothman notes, paraphrasing Al-Ghazali, examining one's thoughts and actions is the closest a believer comes to seeing themselves as God sees them. That quote right there completely encapsulates why bringing the Open PMC Protocol together with this tradition is just so powerful. It's not about making teenagers memorize a bunch of facts. It's about giving them a 1,000-year-old discipline of self-examination nested safely inside a modern mentoring framework. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought from the source material. Right now, algorithmic systems are shaping the next generation 24/7. So the choice isn't whether teenagers will be influenced, that's a given. The real choice is whether they will examine their world and their faith completely alone in the dark, or inside a structured, mentor-guided environment. Will your community's traditions survive by avoiding examination or by consciously engaging it? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating intersection of modern educational protocols and ancient wisdom with me today on The Explainer. Keep learning, keep examining, and I'll catch you next time.